Balloons were tied to every chair, bouncing lightly with each passing breeze from the patio door, and the scent of sugar, frosting, and orange soda hung in the air like something artificial, pretending to be joyful. My grandson was turning 9. He was excited, of course he always is. The way he tugged at his shirt collar and bounced on his heels reminded me of his father at that age before time made everything so much heavier. There was music playing faintly from someone's phone, the clatter of cutlery on paper plates, and yet my ears kept drifting to the silences in between those hollow little gaps that you only hear when your heart is too alert. I watched from my corner of the living room, sipping lukewarm tea, my feet tucked beneath the hem of a cardigan I'd worn too many times to count. I should have been happy. I wanted to be happy. But my eyes landed on my son as he stepped in the door, and I felt something slip inside me, like a thread snapping from the inside of a favorite sweater. He wore jeans too short at the ankles and a shirt with a collar that curled at the edges like tired petals. The colors clashed not by choice but by necessity. There were stains near the hem and a tear under one arm that he tried to keep hidden under a jacket that was clearly too warm for the weather. No one said anything, not out loud, but I heard it anyway. The pause in the room, the quick glance from my daughter-in-law's mother, who didn't even try to hide her smirk, and the way someone asked too loudly, "Oh, is he coming from work?" Though we all knew he wasn't working these days. My grandson didn't notice. He ran to hug him, full of excitement and blind, perfect love. But I noticed, and I felt it in my bones. That aching, tight sort of embarrassment that only a mother feels, not because of how others look at her child, but because she realizes she no longer knows how to protect him from it. For a moment I tried to push the thought away, told myself it didn't matter. It was just clothes, just a party. But I've been alive too long to lie to myself effectively. This wasn't just about a shirt. It was about years. About choices, about how many times I've said yes when I should have said wait or enough. It was about how far he had drifted from the man I once believed he'd become. The cake was wheeled out, a towering blue thing with sparklers instead of candles, and everyone clapped and cheered. I clapped too, smiled for the pictures, but in my heart I felt something starting to turn slowly, like a weather vane catching wind from a new direction. As the kids played in the backyard and the adults huddled in corners gossiping over wine, I watched him. He sat by himself on the edge of a chair too low for his frame, legs bent awkwardly, phone clutched in his hands though the screen stayed black. He kept glancing toward the food table, toward the conversations he wasn't part of, and then away again. I wanted to walk over, sit beside him, say something, but I didn't know what to say. What do you tell your own son when the world has already whispered that he doesn't measure up? I remembered when I used to buy him birthday clothes, wrap them carefully, iron every crease. I used to think love meant covering every hole, mending every seam. But what if all I did was teach him to expect rescue, to wait for help, instead of building his own ladder? Later, as guests filtered out and paper plates piled into trash bags, I stood in the doorway and thanked them all with a smile I didn't feel. My daughter-in-law barely looked at me when she passed her heels clicking sharp against the tile. My grandson hugged me goodbye, still sticky with icing and joy, and I held on to that little hug for a second longer than usual. My son lingered behind. I thought maybe he'd stay a moment. Maybe we'd talk. But instead he muttered a tired, "Thanks, Ma," and walked out before I could find the words I still hadn't formed. And as I watched him go, shoulders hunched, clothes sagging, I realized this birthday wasn't a celebration. It was a signal, a flashing light I could no longer ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about the shirt, that flimsy, faded thing that hung off his shoulders like it had been bought at a roadside bin and forgotten even before he wore it. It wasn't just that it looked cheap, it was that it looked unloved, like it had lived a harder life than the man wearing it. I laid in bed that night, the ceiling fan creaking in its tired rhythm, and my mind kept circling back to it. That shirt became a symbol, a sad little flag waving from the ruins of something I used to build with all my heart, his future. He had once been so careful, meticulous even. I remember when he was younger how he used to polish his school shoes every night without being told, how he folded his shirts like he'd seen in department stores, smoothing every wrinkle with the palm of his hand. He liked to look sharp, said it made him feel like a man, and I'd encouraged it. Bought him the good kind of razors when he turned 16, taught him how to steam a blazer without burning the seams. I had believed with all the fierceness a mother can muster that presentation mattered, that if he looked the part, the world would treat him accordingly. That was how I survived most of my life. Dress well, smile politely, and never let them see the frayed parts. So when he showed up that day with his collar curling up and shoulders slumping down, I couldn't help but feel like something sacred had been dropped and shattered, and I had no idea when it had slipped from our hands. I tried to rationalize it, of course. Maybe money was tight. Maybe he had car trouble. Maybe that wasn't his first choice of outfit, it was all that was clean. But those were the same excuses I'd made the last time. And the time before that. The holidays when his gifts were wrapped in grocery bags. The wedding he showed up late to blaming traffic, but wearing tennis shoes under a wrinkled suit. The job interviews he canceled. The birthdays he forgot. Every excuse had become its own little nail gently hammering at the foundation of the boy I'd once known. And I had held the hammer too, every time I made peace with it, every time I covered for him, every time I said, he's just going through something, instead of asking why he never came out the other side. There was no pride left in his eyes. That's what stung the most. Not the clothes, not the judgment from others, not even the discomfort of seeing him so clearly out of step with the world around him. It was that his eyes didn't fight back anymore. They used to. I remember him as a teenager standing in our kitchen, chin-high fists, curled, insisting he would make something of himself. Back then he had fire, but now he just looked tired, dull, as though life had drained the color out of him and he hadn't even noticed. Or worse, he'd accepted it. I walked past the hallway mirror on my way to the kitchen, and I caught my own reflection in the glass. The lines around my mouth have deepened. My eyes, too, have dulled a bit, though I like to think there's still some steel in them when needed. I stood there a while just staring at myself, and I whispered, "What happened?" I didn't even know if I meant him or me. Maybe both. Maybe somewhere between raising him and rescuing him, I forgot that love wasn't supposed to be an endless bailout. That dignity can't be handed down like a spare coat. It has to be grown from within. I made tea again, even though I hadn't finished the first cup that morning. Same chipped mug, same 2 sugars, same quiet ache in my chest. The house was dark except for the kitchen light, and everything looked softer, more forgiving. I sat down at the table and tried to piece together the last decade in my mind, like a puzzle dumped on the floor. Where did we go wrong? Was it when I paid off that first credit card for him, swearing it was just a one-time favor? Was it when I co-signed for that car he never finished paying? Or was it long before that, when his father walked out and I vowed to make sure my boy never felt abandoned again? I wonder now if I held him too tightly, shielded him too much from failure. Maybe in trying to save him, I also took away his need to rise. There's a kind of shame that doesn't scream. It just sits inside you like damp in the walls, spreading slowly, quietly until everything feels cold. That's how I felt thinking about him in that shirt, Not angry, not even disappointed, just ashamed that I'd given so much and somehow it still hadn't been enough to make him believe in himself. I thought about the birthday again, the way people looked at him, and the way he didn't seem to care. I imagined what people would say when I was gone, how they'd talk about the way he drifted the opportunities. He never took the rooms he never fully entered, and I couldn't stand the thought of my name being tied to that kind of legacy. Not because I needed praise, but because I needed peace. I needed to know that all those sleepless nights, all those shifts I worked, all those sacrifices, weren't wasted on someone who had decided to stop trying. That night I opened my drawer, the one I rarely touch. Tucked in the back behind old photos and expired coupons was a manila folder. Inside, the copy of my will. The original was with my attorney, of course, but this was the one I could scribble on. Make notes. Remind myself of who I'd once trusted with what. I didn't do anything that night. Not yet. But I placed the folder on the table. Let it sit there. Let it breathe. Let it remind me that love, too, must be accountable. The next morning I watched the sun filter through the curtains, casting pale lines across the hardwood floor, like the bars of a cage I didn't realize I'd built for myself. The folder was still on the kitchen table, unopened but loud. You'd think a few pages of paper wouldn't weigh much, but they did. They pressed against my chest every time I looked at them, and they tugged at memories I wasn't ready to revisit. I made coffee slowly, more out of ritual than need, and stood at the sink while it brewed, staring at nothing. I could still hear the birthday chatter in my ears, the way the laughter rose around my grandson and floated past my son like he wasn't even there. And he didn't flinch. That's what haunted me most. He didn't flinch. There's a specific kind of heartbreak when you realize someone has grown numb to being dismissed, that they've made peace with being overlooked, that somewhere, perhaps, without even knowing it, they've stopped hoping for dignity. And I thought I raised him better than that. But parenting is not arithmetic. It's not effort and success out. It's a stew of hope and chance and compromise and exhaustion. And sometimes even with the best of intentions, things rot at the bottom of the pot. I sat at the table and finally opened the folder. Inside was a tidy list, names, assets, percentages, neat little rows that had once felt so solid, so final. I stared at his name. There it was, written in my own hand, next to a slice of a home he hadn't visited in 6 months, and a savings account he probably didn't even know existed. I had written it years ago, when he still showed up with ideas and ambition and a new shirt every Easter. I had pictured him walking proudly through the door after I was gone, touching the walls of this house like they were sacred. But now I wasn't sure he even wanted the weight of it. And worse, I wasn't sure he deserved it. I closed the folder and let my hands rest on top of it. My fingers traced the worn edges, the ink smudges. This house, this life, all of it had been built on sacrifice. On days I went without so he could have. On nights I worked doubles while he slept. On birthdays I skipped. And holidays I cooked through, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I had scraped and pinched and made things stretch that shouldn't have stretched. I had patched holes in our world with threadbare hope, and all I ever wanted in return was to know it wasn't for nothing, that the soil I tilled had borne something solid, something proud. But all I saw now was a man who shuffled through parties like a guest in his own life, wearing his resignation like a uniform. I thought back to the time I gave him money for his business idea. A little tech repair thing. He said it would be mobile, quick, for people who needed urgent help. He even showed me a mock-up logo on his cracked iPad. I believed him, wrote a check for $5,000 and told him to send me a photo when he opened his first client's phone. He never did. When I asked months later, he said it didn't pan out, that there were too many fees, that the market was saturated. I didn't press. I nodded, said something soft like, "Well, you tried." But that night I cried in the bath and didn't know exactly why. Maybe because I knew even then that he hadn't really tried at all. A mother knows. We always know. Not right away, not loudly. But deep down there's a part of us that recognizes when our child is bluffing. And we want so badly for the bluff to turn true that we let it slide again and again until it becomes a pattern, until it becomes their identity. And then we look around one day and realize the man we raised never stood up because he never had to, because we held him up even when our backs began to break. That was the weight I was carrying now, not just disappointment, but guilt. Because if he looked cheap, it wasn't just his choices. It was mine too. Every time I rescued him, I told him it was okay to sink. Every time I excused the shirt, the shoes, the missed calls, I was confirming his own low expectations. Maybe if I had let him fall harder earlier, he would have learned to climb. Instead, I had softened every landing. And now he had stopped jumping altogether. The doorbell rang, jarring me from my thoughts. It was a delivery, a card, and small bouquet from my grandson. "Thank you for the best party," Grandma it read in scratchy handwriting that tilted off the lines. I smiled. A real one this time, because he still saw me, still felt the warmth I tried to give. It reminded me why I had poured myself out in the first place. Love. Always love. But love without boundaries isn't generosity. It's surrender. I placed the card beside the folder and stared at them both. One a reminder of innocence, the other a relic of misplaced hope. And I felt something begin to settle inside me, not bitterness, not yet, but a quiet shift, a tilt in the axis. For the first time in a long while, I wondered if I needed to change, not because I was angry, but because I was finally clear about what I'd built and what I could no longer protect. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and scheduled a meeting with my attorney. I didn't know exactly what I'd say yet. I didn't need to, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done pretending that love was measured by what you left behind. Sometimes real love means choosing peace over obligation, clarity over tradition. And in my heart, a new kind of will was already being written, one that honored not just what I had, but who I had become. It was a Tuesday when I saw the envelope, one of those padded yellow ones, with peeling edges tossed haphazardly on my front porch, like junk mail nobody wanted to touch. I bent down slowly, knees cracking in protest, and brought it inside. No return address, just my name scrawled in that lazy, familiar handwriting I'd once watched on every permission slip and report card. Inside was a birthday card, late, of course, and a folded $20 bill. That was all. No note, no message, just a card with a joke on the front and his name scribbled inside like an afterthought. I stood by the kitchen counter and stared at it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. $20. I've spent more than that on his toothpaste when he was 13. I gave more than that the first time he asked for help with rent. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the weight of meaning, or lack of it. There was something so empty about that little bill, something that made the walls echo a bit more. I don't expect gifts. I've lived too long to need trinkets. But I do expect care, thought, effort. And this was the equivalent of turning away mid-sentence. I put the card in the drawer with the folder, where all the soft disappointments now lived lined up in quiet rows like forgotten tombstones. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside and sat on the bench in the backyard. The wind was gentle, brushing against my skin like an old friend asking if I was all right. I wasn't. But I didn't say it out loud. I just closed my eyes and listened to the wind chimes, those metal pedals I'd bought years ago on a whim from a roadside stand, back when I still believed in omens and signs. I watched the leaves twitch and scatter across the grass, and I thought about how many pieces of myself I'd scattered into my son's life. How many birthdays. How many little envelopes I'd sent over the years, filled with cash, encouragement, and guilt. I had sent him love disguised as lifelines, and he had used them every time without once looking back. It was like sending water down a dry well, hoping one day it would rise and reflect the sky. But it never did. And now, standing there with that card in my hands and that folder in the drawer, I realized I wasn't mourning what he had become. I was mourning what I had allowed. The next morning I took out a different envelope, one I'd been saving for something important. Heavy cream paper, a smooth flap that sealed like a secret. I sat at the table and began to write, not to my lawyer, not yet, but to myself. I needed to see the words, to feel the truth in ink. I wrote, "You are not cruel for drawing a line. You are not bitter for needing space. You are not selfish for protecting what's left." It wasn't a poem, it wasn't even neat, but it was mine, and it was honest. Because the truth is, I was tired. Tired of being the fallback, the financial plan, the emotional sponge. I had begun to feel like a faded banknote, passed around valued for what I could give, not who I was. And even now, even with this clarity blooming in my chest, I still felt the tremble of old guilt creeping in. That voice in my head whispering, "He's your son. He's trying. He's struggling." But another voice, quieter, older, more weathered, whispered back, "And you are tired, and you are allowed to be." That's the trick of motherhood. The tether never quite snaps. It stretches thin, frays, but it clings. And yet I knew if I didn't cut it carefully, it would wrap around my ankles and keep me from walking the last stretch of my own life freely. And I wanted freedom now. I didn't need more noise. I didn't need more reasons to worry about a man who wouldn't worry for himself. I needed stillness, peace, something like silence, but with meaning behind it. I looked at the old ledger in my desk. It held every expense I'd tracked over the years: braces, textbooks, summer camps, broken appliances, missed, rent car repairs, gas money, Christmases. Pages and pages of handwritten proof that I'd been there, that I'd poured more than just love. I'd poured resources, energy, and fragments of my soul into making sure he had a softer landing than I ever did. And what had come of it? A man who could send a $20 bill in a birthday card and think it counted. That evening I had dinner with my neighbor Carol from 2 doors down. She's a widow too, sharp as a tack with eyes like polished marbles, and a wit that stings but never wounds. Over baked chicken and green beans I told her everything, not for advice, just to say it out loud. And when I was done, she didn't tell me to forgive. She didn't tell me to try harder. She just reached across the table, took my hand in hers, and said, "You're allowed to stop." And I believed her. The next day I pulled out the folder again. I circled his name, not with a pen, just with my fingertip. It was time to do something about it. Not out of anger, not to punish, but because I had finally realized something. When someone refuses to value the gifts you give them, the greatest gift you can offer next is your absence. The kitchen felt colder the morning I made the call, not because of the weather, but because I finally let the truth sit openly with me. I dialed my attorney's number with the slow deliberation of someone opening an old wound, knowing full well what might pour out. Each ring felt like a drumbeat, echoing the years I had kept silent, years I'd tiptoed around, disappointment, brushed shame under the rug, and called it unconditional love. When her assistant answered, I simply said I need to make changes to my will, and the words left my mouth not like a burden, but like a confession. She scheduled me for Thursday, 3 days away, 3 days to sit with this decision and make peace with it. I told myself I wasn't doing anything final yet, that it was just a conversation. But in my heart, I knew I wouldn't be backing down. Something had shifted inside me, something tectonic. I wasn't just revising numbers on paper. I was reclaiming my story. That afternoon, I went to the closet in the guest room. Not many people go in there anymore. It's the one space in the house that still smells like old cedar and mothballs, a scent I used to hate when I was younger, but now find oddly comforting. In the back corner behind boxes labeled with yellowing masking tape, Christmas lights, baby clothes, photo albums, there sat a small wooden chest. It was light enough to carry, but heavy with memory. I brought it into the living room and opened it slowly. Inside were years of cards, drawings, notes from my son when he was young. A macaroni-covered heart that once hung on the fridge, now flaking and soft. A picture of us at a school assembly, my arms around his proud little shoulders. His handwriting changed over the years, from careful block letters to the rushed loops of a teenager, to the hurried scrawl of a man always just getting by. I held each paper like it was glass, not because it was fragile, but because I was. And still, as I turned each page, I found myself asking, where did that boy go? There was one letter in particular folded twice, the edges curled. A thank you note, he wrote, after I paid for his first apartment deposit. He was 23. I promise, I'll make you proud, it said in blue ink, with a smudge where his hand must have dragged across the still wet words. I remember getting that letter. I had cried then too, but it was a cry of hope, the kind of tears you shed when you believe the story still has time to end well. Now, holding it again decades later, I realized something hard. He did make me proud. Once. Many times. But that pride wasn't a fixed destination. It wasn't owed to him forever just because it once bloomed. Pride, like trust, is something that has to be tended to, and he had stopped tending to it a long time ago. I placed the letter back in the chest, closed the lid, and rested my hand on top for a long while. Then I whispered aloud to no one in particular, "You didn't break my heart." I just finally stopped ignoring the cracks. It wasn't spiteful. It wasn't angry. It was just real. And realness after all these years of pretending felt like fresh air. That evening, I looked through the list of beneficiaries again. I thought about the house, the one I scrubbed clean from attic to basement every spring, the one I worked overtime to pay off when the bank tried to tighten its grip. I thought about the savings, the insurance, the jewelry passed down from my mother's hands to mine. I thought about who would honor those things, not for their worth, but for what they represented: effort, resilience, survival. And then my thoughts drifted to someone else. Not my son, not even the rest of the family, but a woman I had met only recently, a hospice nurse named Talia. I met her during my stay at the clinic last year. She was the one who brought me tea when my blood pressure dropped. She sat with me during a long, quiet night when the machines beeped too loudly and my thoughts grew too heavy. She listened without judgment, without rushing. She asked about my garden, not my illness. She treated me like a person, not a patient. And after I was discharged, she checked in once, just once, but it stayed with me. A little card in the mail that read, "You're not alone. You're just resting." I hadn't seen her since, but I thought of her often, not because she had done something grand, but because she had made me feel seen, valued, worthy. and suddenly the thought slipped in without resistance. What if the legacy I leave should go where it will be honored, not assumed? I didn't know what I'd do yet, but I knew the seed was planted, and as I sat at the window that night, the moonlight casting soft shadows across the rug, I felt something blooming inside me, a quiet rebellion not against my son, but against the silence I'd kept for far too long. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment, it was a realignment, a reckoning, a mother choosing to stop the slow leak of her soul and finally turn off the tap. The day before my meeting with the attorney, I found myself in the pantry, hands resting against the edge of the top shelf, searching for the good tea, the one I keep in a tin with a faded rose on it, a gift from my sister long past. My fingers brushed past forgotten cans, dusty spice jars, and a bag of rice that had torn slightly at the bottom, its contents spilling like little white pebbles across the shelf. I stopped to clean it, and as I scooped those scattered grains, I felt something unexpected swell inside me, a kind of strange, aching tenderness. Because that's what I had done for years, swept up the little spills my son left behind, quietly, without being asked, without thanks, and always with the hope that the next time there wouldn't be a mess. But there always was, and I always cleaned it. That thought followed me all day, in the way I folded the laundry, pressing out the wrinkles like they held secrets, in the way I cooked dinner, one serving now, not two, and noticed how peaceful the house felt when the only noise was my own breath. I didn't feel lonely, just still, like someone had stopped pacing the floor in my heart. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. I took out the will again that evening and let it sit next to me on the couch. I didn't open it right away. I just let it exist in my presence like a guest I hadn't decided whether to welcome or send away. I kept hearing my mother's voice in my head, soft, worn, that tone she used when she knew she was right, but didn't need you to admit it. A legacy isn't just what you leave behind, it's what you protect while you're still here. And I had protected too much that wasn't protecting me. I thought about how many conversations I'd avoided over the years, times I could have said, "This isn't enough," or "You're not trying," but instead offered a tired smile and another check. Because I thought if I just gave a little more loved, a little louder, he'd finally hear me. But now I know some people hear love as noise. It drowns them instead of lifting them. And the worst part, I had taught him that. With every quiet fix, every second chance, I had shown him that my forgiveness had no edges, that there would always be a soft place for him to fall, even when he stopped bothering to stand. I was not just the mother who gave everything. I was the mother who asked for nothing in return, and that was my mistake. That night I dreamed of my childhood home, the cracked porch steps, the daffodils my mother planted every March even when frost threatened to kill them. In the dream I was standing in the backyard, hanging clothes on the line. The wind was fierce, tugging at my skirt, trying to knock me off balance. But I stood firm. My hands gripped the clothespins. My arms held steady. And when I turned, there was my mother smiling, nodding once, as if to say, "Now you understand." I woke up just before dawn, the room soaked in shadow, and the sky still the color of bruises. But I didn't feel tired. I felt clear. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the table, the same table where I had fed him applesauce from a blue plastic spoon, where I had signed permission slips and baked birthday cakes, and waited for phone calls that didn't come. I opened the will and reread every line. I crossed out his name with a single stroke. Not angry, not hurried, just final. Then I sat back, folded my hands, and breathed. People talk about rewriting a will like it's an act of coldness, like it's a razor drawn across the family tree. But for me, it wasn't about cutting anyone out. It was about carving space for the truth. I wasn't erasing my son. I was acknowledging the woman I had become, the woman who had given decades of her life to everyone else and finally realized she deserved to choose herself in the end. I called the attorney just after 9, told her what I wanted. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. When you're an old woman asking to revise your legacy, no one questions your reasons out loud. They just listen. And for once, that felt like grace. The appointment was set for tomorrow. I wrote it on the calendar in big block letters, bold and unshakable. Will update, 2 p.m. Then I circled it twice. Not because I was likely to forget, but because I wanted to mark the moment when my silence finally gave way to decision. I made myself a simple lunch, sat on the back porch, watched a butterfly land on the railing, its wings bruised but still flying, and I thought, that's what I am now. Not broken, not bitter, just done with pretending my exhaustion was grace, just done letting loyalty become my leash. And as the sun tilted westward and the light began to soften, I whispered to no one, I'm allowed to rewrite the ending. The next day came with clear skies and a stillness I hadn't felt in years. No wind, no rain, no distractions. Just quiet sunlight spilling across the windows, warming the hardwood floors like an invitation to begin again. I sat with my tea no sugar this time and stared out at the bird bath in the yard where a lone sparrow dipped its wings and fluttered away. It was strange how something so simple could feel like a message. Maybe we read signs into things because we need to, or maybe the world really does whisper when we finally get still enough to listen. I wore navy. Simple slacks and a cotton blouse pressed carefully, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I wanted to feel composed. That's what this was now. Not just a correction, not a confrontation. It was composure. A long overdue arrangement between me and the truth I had been trying not to see. My purse was light, just my wallet keys and that manila folder, its edges soft from the number of times I'd touched it without opening it. As I slid it inside, I thought about all the weight we carry in objects, how a folder can feel like history, how ink on paper can become thunder. The drive to the attorney's office was uneventful. Same cracked sidewalk, same sleepy traffic lights, same patch of road that always dipped a little more than expected. But my heart thudded steadily like something being peeled free after years of being plastered down. I didn't feel guilt. That was the miracle. I felt ready, like someone walking into a storm not to survive it, but to end it. The building was small, brick with ivy crawling up the side, and a buzzer that startled me when it rang back through the speaker. Her assistant smiled, kindly, took my name, and gestured me inside. And when I sat down in that quiet room, the leather chair cool beneath me, I unfolded the folder with calm fingers. There was no trembling, no second guessing, just my voice slow and deliberate, as I said I'd like to make a few changes. The attorney nodded. She was younger than me, but not by much. Sharp eyes. No nonsense. She clicked her pen, opened her laptop, and said, "Walk me through what you're thinking." And so I did. I spoke plainly, clearly. No justifications, no meandering stories. I told her I wanted to reallocate a portion of the estate, less to my son, more to a charitable trust. I told her about my savings account and how I wanted to designate some of it to go to programs that support young men learning trades, because maybe if someone else had guided him, we wouldn't be here now. And then I said it. I want to remove him from the deed to the house. She looked up from her notes, not shocked, just steady. Are you sure? Yes, I said, I'm sure. I think I had never been more sure of anything. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spite. It was release. Because the truth was, he didn't want the house. Not really. He wanted what it represented, comfort inheritance status, but not the responsibility, not the roots. He hadn't visited in months, never asked about the leaky faucet or the broken fence gate or the ivy creeping too far into the siding. He loved the idea of it, but not the living, breathing, aging house itself, and that told me everything. I sat there while she typed. The clacking of the keyboard felt like punctuation marks on years of silence. When we were done, she handed me the new draft to review. It looked almost the same. A few lines moved. A few names changed. But to me, it read like freedom. I initialed the changes, signed the bottom, and when she notarized the page and slid it into a folder of her own, I felt lighter, like I'd left something behind in that room, something I'd been carrying far too long. The sun was still bright when I stepped outside, blinding for a moment. But then I adjusted. I stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, letting the heat soak into my shoulders, and I didn't rush to the car. I just breathed, and I smiled, not a wide smile, not triumphant, just soft, real, the kind that doesn't need an audience. When I got home, the house greeted me like an old friend. I kicked off my shoes, turned on the kettle, and let the quiet settle in again. I sat in my usual spot by the window folder, now empty on the table, and I looked at my garden, overgrown in places, messy, but still growing, still alive. And I thought, that's me now, not perfect, not polished, but still here, still choosing what deserves to bloom. That evening I wrote in my journal, a habit I'd neglected, but today felt right. I wrote. Today I chose peace over obligation. Today I remembered my worth. And today I began again, not as a mother, not as a giver, but as a woman who knows what she no longer owes. I closed the book, placed it on the nightstand, and turned out the light. The following week passed in a kind of strange quiet, like the calm that settles in after a storm when everything is still damp and aching, but somehow clearer. The phone didn't ring. My son didn't call, and I didn't chase that silence like I used to. I let it be, let it hang in the air like a curtain drawn between chapters. I didn't realize how much energy I'd spent over the years waiting for him to check in to ask how I was to remember my birthday, without a reminder from his wife. And now that I wasn't waiting, the time stretched long and clean, like freshly washed linens drying in the sun. I went about my days differently. I took walks again, not far, just to the end of the street and back, but I noticed things I hadn't seen in years. The way the light shimmered through the oak leaves, the faint rustle of squirrels in the gutters, the smell of someone baking cinnamon bread 3 houses down. I used to move through life like I was bracing for impact. Now I moved slowly, intentionally, like I had nothing left to shield. I even opened the windows, just a few inches, just enough to let the breeze through. I hadn't done that in a long while, not since the day my son's car broke down in the driveway, and he came in muttering about everything he couldn't afford. I remember feeling like the air had thickened that day, like the walls themselves were listening. But now, with the will changed and the weight lifted, the house felt like it could breathe again, and so could I. I didn't tell anyone right away, not even my closest friend, not because I was hiding, but because I was protecting the peace I'd found. There's a kind of sacredness in not explaining yourself, in doing something quietly and letting it speak for itself. I figured if the day came when my son found out, I'd face it then, but I wouldn't preemptively carry his disappointment, not anymore. Then on a Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the curtain and saw him, my son, standing there with a bag of fast food in one hand, his other hand shoved in his pocket, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. like he wasn't sure he wanted to stay. I paused, breathed, then opened the door. He smiled crooked and tired. Thought I'd stop by. Brought you lunch. It took everything in me to return that smile, without letting my eyes give me away. That's thoughtful, I said. Come in. He sat at the table, unwrapped a sandwich, and started talking about traffic, about some job lead he was considering about his son's soccer team. I listened. I nodded. But I watched him closely. I watched how he chewed with his eyes on the table, how he avoided asking how I'd been, and how he didn't mention the birthday, or the card, or the fact that I hadn't called since. Finally, as he finished eating, he glanced at the manila folder still sitting in the middle of the table. I hadn't put it away. Maybe part of me didn't want to. Maybe I wanted it to be seen even if it wasn't opened. His eyes lingered on it for a second too long. What's that? He asked casually. Paperwork, I replied. Nothing urgent. He nodded but said nothing more. I almost told him then. Almost. But I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because I had realized something deeper. The person he needed to become wasn't going to rise because of my disapproval or be rescued by my resources. If he was ever going to grow into himself, it would have to happen without me cushioning the blow. So I let him sit there in the comfort of not knowing, because sometimes truth doesn't have to be delivered like a hammer. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets life do the speaking. He left not long after, said he'd call soon. I said I hoped he would, and I meant it, but not in the old way, not in the way that used to leave me pacing or staring at the phone. If he called, he called. If not, I would still be here whole, steady, and no longer waiting to be chosen. That night I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting everything in that golden, forgiving light. I thought about the years behind me, the ones filled with scraped knees, school plays, whispered prayers, and sleepless nights. I had done what I could, more than most, and now I had chosen to stop apologizing for needing something in return. I took a sip of wine and whispered into the twilight, "It's okay now. I've put it down." I didn't say his name. I didn't need to. The truth had already been written, not just on paper, but in the silence I'd finally learned to hold without trembling. The following week passed in a kind of surreal stillness, like the kind of quiet that settles over a house when you finally rearrange the furniture and your body doesn't know yet where to sit. I found myself opening drawers I hadn't touched in years, sorting through old greeting cards, recipe clippings, and receipts from grocery trips where I used to buy snacks for a growing boy who never seemed full. The edges of those papers were yellowed now, some stuck together with old tape, others curling in on themselves. I handled them gently like relics from a version of me I'd finally outgrown. I didn't hear from my son again. Not after that lunch. Not even a follow-up text, and I didn't chase it. I let the quiet stretch, let it take up space. I watered the plants, sat by the window with a book I didn't read, just holding the spine and letting the pages fan against my thumb like a wind I was learning to live with. On Thursday, I decided to clean out the hall closet. It had become a kind of shrine to things I no longer used. His old baseball glove still faintly smelling of leather and sunblock. A coat I had bought for him that he wore once, then left behind after a family dinner. He never came back to finish. Even the blanket I knit for his college dorm room folded neatly, like it still held the shape of someone who'd never quite learned how to stay. I took them out one by one, laying each item on the couch. At first I thought I'd donate them, give them away to someone who could make better use of the fabric and thread. But the longer I looked, the more I realized this was never about the things. It was about the part of me that had clung to them like they could explain something, like they could justify everything I had given without return. I carried the glove out to the trash, the coat too, the blanket I kept for now. Not because I couldn't let go of him, but because it had my hands in it, my hours, my intentions. That blanket wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. That evening, my neighbor Carol came by. She brought soup like she always does when she senses something shifting beneath my surface. She didn't ask questions. She just sat with me, spoon in hand, and told me about her daughter's new apartment and the bird that had built a nest in her mailbox. I listened, smiled, and when the moment was right, I told her I had changed the will. She nodded slowly, her spoon pausing mid-air. "I figured you would," she said softly. "You were walking lighter last week." And I realized then, when you finally start choosing yourself, the people who love you don't need explanations. They can see it in your posture, in your breath, in the way your eyes stop scanning the horizon for someone who may never come. We talked for a while longer, and when she left, I stood at the doorway for a long time, watching the taillights disappear into the night. The porch light buzzed quietly overhead, and I caught my reflection in the glass. Just a flicker, just long enough to recognize a woman who looked calm, worn, maybe, but calm. Back inside, I sat down with a notebook, not the journal I write in, but a fresh one with stiff pages and that slight scent of new beginnings. And I wrote down a list, not of grievances, not of regrets, but of boundaries, real, solid, honest boundaries. Not the kind you hint at in size, or stretch thin like dental floss, but the kind you carve into stone. I will not carry what someone refuses to lift with me. I will not explain myself to those committed to misunderstanding me. I will not confuse enabling with loving ever again. I stopped after that, closed the notebook. That was enough for one night. Before bed, I stood in the mirror and combed my hair, counting the silver strands with something like reverence. I used to tug them out as if aging was something I needed to hide. But now they felt earned like streaks of lightning carved into my scalp by every year I kept going when I could have stopped. I climbed into bed, the blanket from the closet draped over my legs, and as I turned off the light, I felt it again, that gentle ache in my chest, not from pain but from release. Like when a muscle has finally stopped clenching. The will was changed, the silence remained, and I was no longer waiting for a knock that might never come. A few days later, I was in the garden kneeling beside the peonies I planted years ago. Those tender pink blooms that always come back no matter how rough the winter, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn right away. I knew the rhythm of that walk, the way the gravel gave under his shoes. My son never walked quietly. Even as a child, he stomped, as though the world owed him a path. And here he was again, showing up without warning, without calling the way he always had, as if I'd been sitting around just waiting. "Hey, Ma," he said. I stood slowly brushing soil from my knees, my gloves still damp with the morning's watering. "You're early," I said, though I hadn't expected him at all. He held out a takeout bag, the smell of lukewarm noodles already seeping through. "Thought you might want lunch." I took the bag, nodding politely, though my stomach felt tight. It wasn't the food, it was the timing, the weight of something unsaid hanging in the air between us. He followed me inside, commenting on the garden, asking about the birdhouse, making small talk that felt rehearsed. I placed the bag on the counter and turned to face him fully, arms crossed, waiting. "I talked to Lisa's brother," he said suddenly, "the one who does estate stuff for his job. He mentioned something weird about how sometimes people take their kids off the deed without telling them." There it was. My heart didn't race. My palms didn't sweat. I just stood there, rooted steady as the words hovered between us like a storm cloud, still deciding whether to break. And I asked. He shrugged, but his jaw was tight. Just made me wonder. You haven't changed anything, have you? I held his gaze calm and unflinching. Yes, I said. I have. He blinked. Once, twice. The silence stretched so long I could hear the fridge humming in the background. You changed the will. I did. His eyes darkened, not in shock, but in insult, like something he assumed was his had just been snatched away. You didn't even talk to me about it, he said. No, I replied, I didn't. There was a long pause, and then in the voice he uses when he's trying to sound casual, but can't hide the bite, he said. So what, I'm just out after everything. The words hit a part of me that used to flinch, the old part, the one that rushed to explain, to soften, to mend. But she was quiet now, tired, and the woman standing here had no more room for guilt. After everything, I echoed calmly. I could say the same. He stepped back like I'd slapped him, but I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't moved. And maybe that's what unsettled him most, the fact that I didn't look like the mother he was used to, the one who bent. You're punishing me, he said. No, I said. I'm protecting myself. He laughed sharp and bitter. From your own son. From disappointment, I said, my voice low. From the silence. From the birthday card with no message. From the man who shows up when it suits him, but never stays. From the years of giving without receiving. He looked away, jaw clenched, breathing hard through his nose. You always made everything about feelings, he muttered. That's why I never told you half the stuff I went through. I nodded. And that's why you'll never understand what I carried. He didn't reply. Didn't need to. The silence was enough. Thick, final, real. I didn't remove you because I don't love you, I said. I removed you because I've finally learned what love needs in return. He looked at me then, really looked. And for a moment, I saw something flicker behind his eyes, hurt, maybe, or recognition. But just as quickly, he buried it. Fine, he said, turning toward the door. Do what you want. I already have. He left without taking the food. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality I felt in my bones, and I stood there in the kitchen alone, but not abandoned, because for once I had chosen solitude over sacrifice. I sat at the table, opened the takeout bag, and ate slowly, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to mark the moment, a meal in the aftermath, a quiet kind of victory. Afterward, I took the empty containers to the trash, then stepped outside. The sun was still shining, and the peonies were beginning to open fully, their petals stretching wide like they had nothing to hide. I sat on the porch and closed my eyes. I hadn't burned a bridge. I just stopped holding it up alone. The next morning came soft, as if even the sky understood I needed gentleness. I moved slower than usual, not out of pain or age, but out of reverence for what had happened, for what had shifted. The air in the house was different, not empty, just still. I used to think silence was something to be filled. Now I understood it could be sacred. I brewed a single cup of tea and sat by the window, where the light touched the floor in golden slats. No phone calls, no texts. Just me in the morning. My son didn't return. I didn't expect him to. He was raised to take comfort in assumptions, and for too long I had been the one he assumed would always understand, always catch, always soften the blow. But when I stood in that kitchen and told him the truth, I saw it in his face, the disbelief, not just that I had changed the will, but that I could do it without flinching. That I had become someone who no longer centered him in every breath. There is a grief that comes with that, Not the loud kind, not the theatrical sorrow people expect when something ends. No, this was a grief that whispered, that moved like dust across the corners of the room, a quiet letting go of the last illusions I held the ones about redemption, about apologies, about the child who might still turn around. But I had stopped waiting for those kinds of turns. Life, I've learned, does not circle back just because we hoped it would. That afternoon, I opened a drawer in the hallway and pulled out a photograph. My son, age 6, wearing his Halloween costume, a pirate sword taped to his belt, one eye squinting behind a paper-patched eye patch. I remembered how he refused to let me take it off even to eat dinner. I remembered how proud he was to be someone bold, someone daring, and I sat with that memory like it was a warm stone in my palm. I don't resent that boy. I never could. But I also don't owe the man he became unlimited forgiveness. Motherhood is not martyrdom. It's a role, a season, and like all seasons, it must change with time, I placed the photo back into its envelope and slid it into a wooden box with the others. Then I picked up the phone not to call my son, but to call my attorney again. There was one more change I wanted to make. When she answered, I told her I wanted to create something lasting, not just a redistribution of assets, but a legacy that reached beyond family. I told her about a foundation I'd once read about, one that funded scholarships for young adults aging out of foster care, people with no safety net, people who never had someone to patch their jeans or remind them how to hold their heads high, people who needed the help I used to give so freely and would now give with direction. She paused and said, "That's a beautiful idea. Do you want it in your will?" "No," I said. "I want it now, while I'm still here to see it." Because I didn't want my impact to wait on a eulogy. I wanted it to move through the world, while my hands could still guide it. That evening I wrote the first check. Not a huge amount, but enough to matter, enough to mean something. I placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and ran my thumb across my return address. My name, still sharp, still mine. It felt different than writing checks to my son. That money had always left my hands like water through a sieve, vanishing without echo. This felt like planting, like something would bloom from it. Maybe not today, maybe not even in my lifetime, but I could feel the roots take hold even now. The mail carrier came just as the sky turned dusky. I placed the envelope carefully at the top of the stack and watched through the curtains as she carried it down the walk, and I thought, this is what it means to take back power, not to shout, not to demand, but to redirect your love toward where it can actually live. I went to bed early that night. No television, no news, just the blanket over my legs and the echo of my own breathing. I pressed my hand over my chest and felt something I hadn't in years, peace. Not perfection, not closure, but the soft hum of dignity restored. And as I drifted to sleep, I whispered into the dark, "I'm not sorry anymore." I woke the next day with sunlight on my face and a strange, almost unfamiliar feeling in my chest, lightness, the kind that doesn't come from sleep alone, but from release. I made my bed with steady hands, smoothing every wrinkle like I was laying old burdens to rest. The house was quiet, but not hollow. It felt occupied by something new now, not a person, not a voice, but a sense of self I hadn't felt in decades, the kind that belongs only to you once you stop asking for permission to be at peace. I sat with my morning tea in the same seat by the window, watching the wind roll through the trees. The phone remained silent. My son had not reached out, and by now I knew he wouldn't not, because he was punishing me, but because silence had always been his refuge when he didn't get his way. That was his way of asserting control, withdrawal. But the difference now was that I wasn't reaching for him through it. I wasn't drafting texts or revisiting old messages or wondering if I should have said something differently. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was watching, observing the stillness like someone finally awake in their own home. I spent most of that morning in my room going through the top dresser drawer, a place filled with trinkets and time. There was the gold locket I hadn't worn since my mother's funeral, a letter opener shaped like a swan that my husband gave me in our second year of marriage, and tucked in the back corner an old birthday card from my son, one of the few he'd written in his 20s, when he still tried to put words to paper. I opened it and read the faded message inside. "Thanks for everything, Mom. I don't say it enough, but I'm lucky to have you." I read it twice, then a third time, wondering who that young man was and why he had vanished. The ink was still legible, but the meaning had dissolved over time. Because it wasn't that he stopped saying it, it was that he stopped showing it. And love, when it is not, followed by action, becomes just another story we tell ourselves to avoid pain. I folded the card not with resentment, but with resolution. There had been love. There had been effort. But love without boundaries had cost me too much. Too many sleepless nights, too many moments of shrinking myself to keep peace. I had been a one-woman support system for a man who never asked what it cost me to keep him from falling. Later that day, I went to the backyard and spent hours tending the soil. It was early spring still, but the ground had already begun to loosen. I pruned the dead leaves, pulled up weeds, got dirt under my nails like I used to when I was younger, and had less fear of knees that creaked or backs that ached. It felt good, grounding, real. There's a kind of healing in tending things that grow in being responsible only for what's in front of you. I planted a small cluster of zinnias, bright, resilient things that thrive in imperfect soil, and as I pressed the seeds into the dirt, I thought of all the energy I'd once poured into my son, how much of myself I'd buried in his potential, and I thought, this is different. These seeds will ask nothing of me beyond water, light, and time. They will not guilt me. They will not vanish. They will bloom or they will not. But they won't carry my love away and leave me holding nothing. After the garden, I took a long shower and laid down on the couch, letting my hair dry in the breeze from the open window. No television, no music, just the hum of a house that finally felt like mine again. I thought about the choices I'd made, about the will, about the silence, about how different all of it would have felt if I had done it years earlier. But maybe I couldn't have. Maybe I needed to be worn down to the edge of myself to finally see where I ended, and he began. In the quiet, I imagined a version of him that might still return one day, not out of entitlement, but out of understanding. A man who knocks, not to demand, but to listen, to apologize, to try. I don't hold my breath for that, but I don't close the door either. I just leave it unlocked inside me. Should he ever choose to knock? But if he doesn't, I will be all right, because now I know that love can be both true and finished, that forgiveness doesn't always mean reinstatement, and that sometimes the most generous thing we can do is let someone learn to live without us, if only to teach them how. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I sat on the porch with a shawl over my shoulders and a cup of chamomile in my hand. The sky went gold and then lavender, and then a deep, satisfied blue. And I whispered for no one but myself, this is what I was afraid of losing my own peace. The first real test came 2 weeks later. A knock at the door, not loud, not angry, just hesitant. When I opened it there, he stood again, my son. Same worn sneakers, same tired eyes. But something was different this time. He wasn't holding fast food. He wasn't smiling that half-hearted smile that always came with an agenda. He was just standing there, hands at his sides, empty. And for the first time in a long while, I saw the boy he used to be peek through the lines on his face. "Can I come in?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside, but said nothing. We sat in the living room, not across from each other like a standoff, but side by side on the couch, like once upon a time when he used to bring me broken toys or bruised knees. I waited. Let the silence do what words couldn't. He stared at his hands, twisting a frayed thread at the cuff of his sleeve. "I heard you sent money to some foundation," he finally said. "That true?" "It is." He nodded once slowly. "So you've got enough for that, but not for your family." The old me might have flinched, might have explained, might have reminded him of the thousands I had given over the years, of the rent payments, the repairs, the phone bills, the countless quiet rescues. But I didn't. I just looked at him and said I gave what I could when it still meant something. He blinked, taken aback. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said gently, "I finally realized I was investing in someone who wasn't investing in himself." He looked at me, then really looked. And for a heartbeat, I thought I saw understanding flicker, but it was chased away by that old familiar resentment. "I'm your son," he said. "And I'm your mother," I replied. "Not your wallet, not your safety net, not your apology machine." The silence that followed wasn't thick this time. It was clean, still. He leaned back, sighing. "I just thought, when you changed the will, I thought maybe I'd done something really wrong." "You didn't do something wrong," I said. "You stopped doing something right." He nodded slowly, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue with. The words didn't sting the way they might have a year ago. They just sat there, heavy, honest, unshakable. "I was mad at first," he admitted. "Felt like a betrayal." "So did I said softly. "For years." He went quiet again. There was a long pause where the only sound was the ticking of the old wall clock, steady, mechanical, unaware of who was grieving, who in the room. I sipped my tea, let the moment stretch. Eventually he stood. "I guess I just came to see if there was anything left to fix." I looked up at him, not with anger, not with pity, just a kind of weary clarity that depends on what you're willing to build and what you're willing to carry yourself. He didn't answer, just gave a faint nod and walked to the door. As he opened it, I said, "If you ever want to come back, not for money, not for favors, but just to talk, I'll be here. But I won't carry the weight for you anymore. You'll have to walk in with your own hands open." He paused. I could see his shoulders rise with a breath, but he didn't turn around, just stepped outside and closed the door gently behind him. I sat there for a long while after he left, not crying, not aching, just still, letting the conversation replay like a slow wind chime in my memory. There was no victory in it, no relief. But there was a sense of balance, like something had been leveled, not solved, not healed, but acknowledged. And sometimes that's enough. Later that night, I took the old family photo off the hallway wall, the one from years ago, him in a suit, me in pearls, both of us smiling like nothing could fall apart. I didn't throw it away. I wrapped it gently and placed it in a drawer. Because love doesn't need to be erased. It just needs to be recontextualized, placed where it belongs, not on a pedestal, but in a frame that fits what it truly was. I replaced it with a painting I'd once bought at a flea market, a quiet landscape, just a path leading through an open field beneath a twilight sky. I looked at it for a long time, that path winding forward, no destination in sight, but clearly leading somewhere. That's where I was now, not angry, not triumphant, just walking a new road. one that didn't require me to drag the weight of someone else's undoing. Just my own breath, just my own steps. It rained the next morning. A soft, steady rain, the kind that doesn't demand anything but presence. I opened the window above the kitchen sink and let the air in. It smelled of wet earth and hydrangea. The leaves outside shimmered with droplets bowing gently under the weight. I stood there for a while, just listening to the water slide down the gutters, the way it tapped gently against the roof, like a visitor who didn't mind waiting. I didn't expect to feel so calm. After everything, after changing the will, after the conversation with my son, after watching him walk away, with all the weight of misunderstanding in his shoulders, I thought I might feel regret, or grief, or something sharper. But instead I felt like a house after a storm, a little battered maybe, but intact. Cleared out, quiet, in the most sacred way. I sat with my journal later that day and wrote one sentence: I am no longer an extension of anyone else's need. I underlined it, twice. Then I wrote it again. The phone rang in the late afternoon. Not my son, Carol. She was checking in. She asked how the garden was coming along, whether I'd finally tried the rosemary bread she'd dropped off, and if I wanted to walk with her to the church rummage sale next weekend. I said yes, not because I needed the distraction, but because I wanted to feel the world again on my terms with people who saw me without strings attached. After we hung up, I made myself a bowl of soup, simple, brothy. The kind of food that warms you from the inside without needing to prove anything. I sat at the table and ate it slowly. No rush, no noise, just me and the rhythm of my breath. Later that evening, I found myself flipping through a book I hadn't opened in years, an old collection of poems that once lived on my nightstand before it got replaced by bills and to-do lists and overdue favors. I came across a passage I'd marked decades ago with a piece of thread. Some roots grow too deep to move, but not too deep to be pruned. And when they are, the bloom is quieter, but stronger. I don't know why I underlined it back then. Maybe something in me already knew that one day I'd have to choose between the son I loved and the self I had long ignored, between continuing to give and learning how to let go. I closed the book, rested it against my chest, and exhaled. There's a peculiar freedom in letting people think what they want, in allowing others to tell their version of the story while you stop correcting them. Let them say you were cold. Let them say you turned your back. What they won't say, but what I know, is that I stood up for myself in the quietest, clearest way a mother ever can, by stopping the pattern, by refusing to reward neglect with inheritance, by choosing truth over tradition. That night, as I moved through the house, turning off lights, I paused in the hallway and looked at the new painting again, the one with the path. The colors had changed in the soft glow of the lamp. The road looked longer, less certain, but more inviting. I imagined myself walking that path. No baggage, no whispered apologies trailing behind me, just the sound of my own footsteps and the quiet thrill of not knowing what comes next. There was something almost holy in that. I brushed my teeth, pulled the covers back, slid into bed with the ease of someone who no longer rehearses hard conversations in her head. I didn't clutch the phone like I used to, didn't glance at it for missed calls. It sat quietly on the nightstand, unnoticed, unneeded. Before I turned out the light, I whispered one last thing into the stillness. I didn't stop loving him. I just stopped giving him all of me. And in that there was no rage, no punishment, just peace. Just the sound of rain returning to the roof, steady and sure, like the echo of boundaries finally held. The last time I saw him was a month later, at the park near the church where they were holding the spring festival. Children were running wild between booths, faces sticky with cotton candy music, playing from a cheap speaker tied to a tree. I hadn't gone for the event, I'd just needed a walk, needed fresh air, and to remind myself that the world kept spinning with or without the weight of old expectations. I was carrying a cloth bag with fresh bread from the corner stall when I saw him, my son, sitting alone on a bench with a bottle of water in a tired posture. He saw me too. Our eyes met for a second longer than strangers, but neither of us smiled. I kept walking. It wasn't anger that kept my steps steady, it was knowing that I had done all I could, that he knew where I stood, that nothing needed to be said. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can give someone who refuses to meet you halfway is space, not silence laced with guilt, not distance dipped in resentment, just space, wide enough for them to grow if they ever choose to. When I got home that afternoon, I placed the bread on the counter, poured myself a glass of water, and sat down. The light from the window was softer now. The seasons had shifted. My garden had started to bloom in new directions, colors I didn't even plant this year. And I realized that sometimes things find a way to thrive, even when you forget to tend them. I opened the notebook where I'd been jotting down small memories, not the ones full of pain, but the quiet ones I wanted to keep. The first time my grandson held my hand, without needing a reason. The Sunday I drank coffee outside, and the sky looked like forgiveness. The moment I mailed that first check to the foundation, and felt something inside me uncoil for the first time in years. And I added a new memory, saw him today, said nothing, felt everything, walked on. Because that too was a victory. I spent that evening doing something simple, mending a button on an old cardigan. My fingers, though stiffer now, remembered the motion. In and out, pull and knot. We mothers know how to fix things. But I wasn't mending for him anymore. I was mending for me, for the comfort of a sweater that had held me longer than any apology he never offered, for the warmth I could wrap around myself no matter who stayed or left. As night fell, I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for ritual, for myself, for the woman I had become. I sat by the flame watching it sway like it had breath, and I thought about all the women who had given too much in silence, who were told to endure, to forgive without pause, to be the anchor, the lifeboat, the shore. And I thought not with sadness, but with strength. We deserve more. Not because we are mothers, not because we are wives or caretakers or givers, but because we are human, because our worth is not measured in how much we can lose before someone notices we're gone. I turned off the lights one by one, slow and steady. The house didn't feel lonely. It felt chosen, like every object knew it had been kept for a reason, like every room had space now to breathe. Before I went to bed, I paused at the window and looked out over the yard. The moon was high and round the stars blinking like they were listening. I whispered a simple truth into the night one that had taken me a lifetime to learn. I didn't stop loving him. I stopped abandoning myself. And that was the end of it. Not a door slammed. Not a fire set. Just a mother finally quiet in her own home. Just a woman who rewrote her will, not just on paper, but in her heart. And that more than anything was enough.